Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 25. Today my guest is Bill Singleton, a fine artist and nature journaler living in Tucson, Arizona. In his work, Bill blends traditional and digital art techniques to create a really unique process and style, utilizing the best of both forms of art. In this interview, we dive deeply into his process, the tools, techniques, and also the technology that Bill uses to create his work. So, thank you for being here with me. It's really, really fun to put a face to your art. I'm looking forward to the chat.
Yeah. Thanks for calling me.
So I always love to start interviews by chatting about early nature experiences. And I read that you were born in Dallas, Texas, and then you made a move to Tucson, Arizona. I'm interested in your early nature experiences as a child.
Yeah, so growing up in Dallas is really green. East Texas is very green. It's really pretty. And both of my parents were from the country, and they both grew up on farms and out in the country in northeast Texas. So they were always gardening at the house. So my mom always had her flower beds out front, and my dad always had his vegetable gardens in the backyard. And so I grew up in both, kind of wandering through everything. And yeah, it's pretty cool. And then roaming around East Texas. I was in a rural part of Dallas on the north side. So it was a lot of rural area back then all around my house. And so we would always just go wandering through the streams and little forests and fields. And so it's pretty cool. And then I moved to Tucson when I was about 12 because I had really bad asthma. And they tried everything and nothing helped. And so the doctor said, maybe a change of climate. So came to Tucson and my asthma was mostly gone once I was here. So yeah, so we stayed. So
is that because of drier air?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's it. So yeah, depending on what you're allergic to or whatever, for me, Tucson was great. But it was really a transition because, Dallas, like I said, it's pretty green and humid. And then I move into the desert and it's like different plants, different animals, different people. Is way different than where I came from. So
yeah. Can you describe a little bit about what the desert looks like?
Yeah, so the desert, when I first moved here, I thought I had been kind of punished or something because, I walk out in the desert, I'm like, this stuff is half dead, it's just rocks and cactus, sticky things with thorns on it. And then one of the kids in the neighborhood goes, come on, let's go out in the desert. And I'm like, why? So I started roaming around with him and I'm like, wow, this is pretty amazing, and I started learning about, different plants and animals, and it's a pretty amazing place. So, yeah, it's pretty cool growing up here.
Yeah, wow. And did you always know that you wanted to be an artist? Did you know this from a young age or did it come to you later?
Yeah, my parents told me that the teachers would always send home notes like, oh, this kid's got to be an artist, And my mom said, well, she goes, I thought all kids drew pictures like that. Teachers like, no, not like this. So,
Yeah.
So, yeah, I got that all through school. I was like, yeah, he's going to be an artist, so.
And you did. You grew up, you went to university, you studied a Bachelor of Fine Art. Mm-hmm. And were you always drawn to natural subjects, even at university?
Well, I did a little bit of everything, really. And then once I graduated, I got into galleries for a while. And I was doing a lot of still lifes and sort of kind of landscapes.
And how did you become a nature journaler? How did you come to nature journaling?
Well, like I said, I always did landscapes and stuff, and I freelance. So I did gallery work for a while, and then I started doing freelance illustration. Mm-hmm. And in that I did literally everything. I worked for years for different publishers doing mostly science illustration and stuff, but but really all kinds of stuff. And then later on, I ended up working. I got a job with Pima County, and Pima County is huge. It's actually bigger than several states back east in the U.S. And it just so happened that they were starting this new program to save the desert, because the urban encroachment was just sort of taking over everything. And so they started. The county set this plan in implementing of setting aside the Sonoran Desert for for everybody. And so once they saw what I could do, because I had just started there, and they're like, "Wow, you can do illustrations of this stuff." So I ended up doing like hundreds of illustrations of all local plants and animals and all kinds of stuff. So that was pretty good. So I really learned a lot. And the cool thing about it was I was working with scientists in the area, and I'd be like, "Hey, what about this species?" Like, because back then, like, wasn't that much internet photos of a lot of these species, and so I'd go talk to these scientists and get some good photos, that I could work from, and so I started doing a lot of different plants and animals like that, and then I retired from the county, and then I thought, what am I going to paint now? Because all my professional life, I've been painting pictures for other people.
Yes.
And so it took me a while to what do I want to do?
Yes.
And so I would, one of the things I started doing is trying to do quick paintings. So I'd do these like paintings a day, and I'd set time limits for myself, like 1 hour painting and stuff. And then one day I came across that John Law's book, Nature Journaling.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, wow, this is such a cool concept, a cool idea. And I can roll what I'm doing. I'm doing these sort of 1 hour illustrations already on the spot. And so I thought, I'll do a journal with them, And so for the first time, I started writing on my paintings, kind of, And so I started working on paper, with gouache and acrylics and then writing in notes. And I thought, wow, I really liked it. So I just kept going and going.
Mm.
And I found that 1 hour limitation really helped me to focus on what I was looking at. And if I have more time, I start embellishing it, and just getting too detailed and nitpicky. And I still do those too sometimes when I need to. When I need to do like scientific illustration, I'll do that type of thing. But this other journaling I've been doing more is a little bit more impressionistic, where I'm going in and just catching that sort of the essence really of what it is, whatever it is I'm doing. That's what I'm trying to do. So it's kind of a Zen kind of thing, really, that I try to get in there and capture it. And so I'll do like a half hour, and I found that time limit really helped me to focus on that. So that I just kept doing it and just kept rolling it along. So it's been fun.
Yeah, and your pages are so inspirational and so iconic. They just, as soon as I see them, I know that it's you. You have a style that's really unique to you. And I'd love to talk about your tools and techniques, if that's okay, because
Sure.
I find them so different from anything else I'm seeing coming out. And one of the things that it's really characteristic of you is that you enjoy working on toned paper. And I'm wondering about that. What do you love about toned paper?
Yeah, so when I first started doing it, I was working all on white paper, and I started looking at James Gurney, the guy that did the Dinotopia books, and he's got a lot of stuff on where he goes out and he does these really quick paintings in casein or gouache. And so I thought, I'm going to get casein. So I bought some casein. I thought, oh, this stuff's great. And then I started trying gouache, and I'm like, wow, this is really good. Because before that, I'd been working with acrylics. Well, actually, I started painting in oils. That's what I learned, how to paint in oils. But oils take too long to dry for commercial work, so I switched over to acrylic. And then I tried the acrylic for these quick nature studies, and it just didn't work. I mean, for some stuff it does, but what I found is acrylic is too translucent. And I found it to do these quick, sort of more gestural, fast paintings that gouache or casein are the best because they're opaque. And so the good thing about opaque paint is you can paint light colors over dark colors. And you can also do dark over lights. But if you do that with acrylic, if you say have a black and then you paint a white stripe over it, it looks kind of milky. It just doesn't have the punch. Whereas you do the same thing with gouache, that white will pop. And so then I just transitioned over into doing that. And then after a while, I discovered acrylic gouache, which is sort of the marriage of gouache and acrylic paint. So since I'd been painting with acrylic for 40 years, it was a really easy transition for me. And so that's what I've been doing now lately the most is like this Liquitex acrylic gouache. And that's the one I've been using the most of anything. And there's also a Holbein acrylic-gouache that I use too.
These are materials that I've never heard of until I was looking at your work. And I wonder what's the benefit of acrylic gouache over traditional gouache?
So the main difference in the two is acrylic gouache is basically acrylic. So, when acrylic dries, it's dry.
Yes.
But with gouache, you can re-wet it. And so there's pros and cons both ways. Re-wetting is sometimes really good if you're doing, especially for scientific illustration, when you're doing very tight renderings and you need to, have a shadow that gradually, fades off or whatever. You can put a light color next to a dark color and then get your brush a little wet and sort of tease those two together and re-wet them even after it's dry. And so it's great for that kind of stuff. And it's also great for your palette itself. Like, the gouache dries really quick, actually almost immediately. So your palette dries really quick too. So you mix a really good color and then it'll dry. But with gouache, you can re-wet it on your palette and keep using it. Or you can even use it a week later, if you put your palette away and come back and like, here's this color that I made. So that's that with gouache. Now with the acrylic gouache, it's not like that. You can't re-wet it. You can't so it's really kind of more permanent in a way. And that's one of the things I like about it. Plus, I'm sort of used to working with acrylics anyway. So so that's why I've done that. And actually, I see I meandered off. Your question was why I like toned paper, right?
Yeah.
So what I found with the gouache and the acrylic too, and the cool thing about toned paper is that it's a medium ground. It's a medium value. So whereas with white, I always think of it as sometimes I'm sort of fighting against the white. And you have to go from white down to these darker and darker values. Whereas if you start with a gray or a tan paper, you start in the middle. And then you can use a lighter color. If say we're using gray paper, I can use lighter colors to lift off of that gray, to come off of it, and I can use darker ones to go down. So it's a nice medium place to start, and I feel like that way I'm not fighting the values really. I'm already halfway there, and sometimes it's cool just to lift out a few little highlights here and there right off the paper or dark areas without having to put in a tone first.
Tone the whole thing.
Yeah,
and I think it gives such a beautiful effect. It pops in a really strong way. I feel the toned paper highlights on a toned paper, especially.
Yeah, especially with the gouache. And I've tried the same thing with acrylics, and it's not as effective because of the translucency. But yeah, with that opaque gouache, it does. It just pops right off the paper. And if you do your tones right, from light to dark, and I also have a thing of warm and cool that I always keep in mind. And so I work between the light and dark and the warm and cools, and that's how you get that pop kind of. So.
And your work has this real depth. Like you're not afraid of dark colors, and you will deepen a shadow to the point where it's almost completely black, and then you'll grade it coming forward so that your piece has real three-dimensionality. And maybe that's something I was looking at your work, like trying to articulate what makes it unique, and I think part of it is the toned paper, and part of it is this real depth, this real three-dimensionality that you achieve from using really darks and bright highlights. And I'm wondering about that because sometimes people are really tentative with shadows or with darks, and you might get I know this was an issue for me when I started painting. I was just too tentative, but you just punch in the darks, and I really love that.
Well, the good thing about gouache is you can just paint over it. If you do a tentative color that's not light or dark enough, which I do all the time, we can just paint right over it the next time. And so really all those paintings are sort of a series of adjustments, because you lay a tone down and you think, oh, this is great for the shadow. And then you put a few highlights in and then you're like, oh, wait, that's not the right shadow tone at all. And so I'll go back into it again, and sometimes again and again, but you kind of keep hitting it. But because the gouache is opaque, you can just keep layering it down. And that's one of the advantages that I found with the acrylic gouache is you can layer it a little more than with the traditional. The traditional gouache, if you paint over it too much, it starts getting a little bit gooey. And also, if your brush is too wet, you start lifting up the color that's already underneath it, which just really messes it up. So that's why I've been using the acrylic more like that. But yeah, so you can set these tones for the background, let's say, and then you can go back and readjust it as needed. As you're putting these lights and darks, you sort of keep going back and forth. But I think the main reason mine look more, like you said, that 3D look is because of the actual warm and coolness of the colors.
Tell me about that.
So, I mean, a lot of it's got to do with value, and value is really critical, but it's the warm and cool that really makes the stuff pop. And so most of the time with my shadows, they're warm shadows.
Okay.
And then that's the way it is in nature most of the time. And my sort of rule is a rule of opposites. Whatever your light color is in your highlights, if that's a cool, then your shadows are going to be warm.
Okay.
If your highlights are warm, then your shadows are going to be cool. And this warm and cool is a relative thing within this painting.
Yes.
So it's not like I'm saying, warm shadows, like add more red or something, and it won't look red. But actually, I do that. Some of the times I'll put more burnt umber in the shadows, and you think, oh, that's going to be too red. But then you look, and it's not. It just looks like a dark brown color. And so I'll put this warm, dark background in, and then I'll say maybe have some really bright lime-colored green leaves and just pop, 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 and put these leaves, dash them on there. And then you get that push and pull. And so the greens, that lime green, will be a very cool color. And then your eye sort of magically just like pushes them. And your eye says, oh, these greens are coming forward. And that warm color is going backwards. And so your brain is really doing sort of all the work in a way.
Ah, that's fascinating. Yeah, wow. That makes a lot of sense. But until you articulate it like that, I guess you don't think of it like that, because it is what it is on the page. That's a great tip.
Yeah, and also when I used to paint landscapes a lot, it was hard to get the lighting right, and I could never quite get it. I mean, sometimes I would hit it and sometimes I wouldn't, until I sort of came across that rule of opposites, of warm and cool. And then once I got that down, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is it. This is how to do it. And so I always use that. And I found that most of the time, like, it stays the same. So the ambient light that you're picking up, if you're in a forest or looking at a plant or whatever, the ambient light is from the sky. And used to, I think, oh, the sun is a warm color. It's yellow. So I will make the highlights more yellow. But maybe right on that pure highlight, it may have a little bit of warmth to it. But really, most of that light is ambient light coming from a blue sky. So it's cool. And so anything that's not in that light is going to be warmer than that cool light. And that's pretty much the way it is all the time, unless it's like it's sunset or sunrise or something where it's actually warm light hitting. Then that's the exception. But then it's the opposite. It's the same rule, just flipped. So then you have warm highlights, cool shadows. And if you stick to that, it's kind of magical, really.
Yeah.
It just works. So.
Oh, wow. That's really cool. So you do this wonderful thing on your palette where you work with a metal palette on a clipboard, and you create a palette that's the same color as your paper. And I love this idea, and I'd love for you to describe this genius trick that you do with your palette.
Yeah, so what I do is, there's one thing I learned in college that was really good. It's this thing called simultaneous contrast, which is that colors look different depending on the colors around them. So I think you've seen some of those little eye tricks online where there's an orange square, it was surrounded by blue, and then you have that same color orange surrounded by red or something, and it looks like two different oranges.
Yes.
And so it's the same way on your palette. So, if I have a white palette, if I'm painting on white paper, I'll use a white palette. If I'm using tan paper, I use a tan palette for that same reason, so that the orange I'm mixing on the tan palette looks the same orange as when I'm putting it on my painting. And the way I do that is I just get the same paper that I'm painting with, and I get a clear sheet of it's this I think it's Xerox paper or something for Xerox machines. It's just clear.
The transparency paper.
Yeah, transparency paper. And I just clip that right over it on the clipboard, over the same paper. So it's a really fast way. And then I just, it's disposable. So yeah, I just throw away the plastic afterwards and start again. You save the paper. So.
Yeah, it's something I hadn't thought about. But it makes absolute sense to do that you need to you need to check it on the paper that you're going to be adding it to. That makes total sense.
Yeah, and also what happens too is like, say that orange on your palette and then on your painting is the same orange, but as you're getting more and more stuff on your painting, that orange is looking different. But usually on your palette too, you're making those same colors out. So you have sort of the reference over there also. So that really helps you keep track of the colors, of the true colors of how to put it, and how to mix it and put it in the right place. So
it's a very, very cool trick. I was watching some of your painting classes on Skillshare, and you describe your process of painting natural subjects, and I was really impressed with how much depth you get in a painting with just a small number of colors. Sometimes only 4 colors, sometimes 3. What do you think about this, having a limited palette? Is it something that you do deliberately, or is it just natural? How does that go, having a limited palette?
Yeah, so, when I first started painting, I do like everybody else, you put out like every tube of color you have, you put it on the palette. And then I realized I'm throwing 90% of the paint away, which is really wasteful. But sometimes you need to do that if you're painting something real colorful. If you're doing rainbows, you need all the colors. But I started looking at Zorn, Anders Zorn, who is I think Norwegian or Swedish painter in the early 1900s. And he used a really limited palette. And so I started experimenting with that. And then I came down to, I sort of have my own method now where it's basically only 3 prime colors, red, yellow, and blue. And those are the primary colors because you can't mix any color to get those colors. But with those 3 colors, you can get every other color. You can get green and violet and orange and everything else, everything in between. And so really, whenever you're mixing colors, you're just pushing towards blue or towards red or towards yellow. And so what I started doing is I'd look at what I'm going to paint, and then I'd see, okay, what colors do I need? And I just try to pick the minimum color. So I usually almost always have black and white on my palette. A lot of white and actually very little black, but sometimes you need it. And then instead of just having like blue, red, and yellow as the primaries, I will use a variation of those sometimes. So I'll like pick any blue, something in the blue family, and or something in the red family, something in the yellow family. So a lot of times the paintings will be like, instead of red, I'll have maybe like burnt umber, and that's my red. And, and then, a different blue. And sometimes I substitute greens for something blue. So sometimes I'll have a palette that's, like green, burnt umber, and yellow ochre. And you mix those and it actually captures pretty much every color that you're needing for that painting. And of course, depending on what you're painting, it may change, but I can always add another color if I need to. But the cool thing about painting with a limited palette like that is that it sets up a harmony in all your colors, because since you are only working with those, say, 3 colors or five colors if you're including black and white, since you're just painting with those, everything you mix is related to one of those. There's a little bit of that blue and that burnt umber and vice versa, and a little bit of yellow. Yes. And so there's a harmony that's in those colors. And even sometimes I look at my palette afterwards and the palette looks cool. It's cool as an abstract painting, and there's a certain harmony of the paint in there and all those colors. And so that all, translates into the painting, and it creates this really harmonious thing, and it's really easy for your eye to read also like that. So yeah, that's why. So I started limiting it more and more, once again, sort of a Zen thing, because, what's the minimum stuff I need? And I found out I don't need all of those colors all of the time. Sometimes you may need all the colors, but not all the time for sure.
But it's not. But when I look at your work, I never think it's a limited palette. You seem to get a really wide range with just a few colors, like you say, because you're mixing.
Yeah, and as long as you have at least one from each of the three primary families, then you do really get the full range. And if you've ever looked at Zorn's paintings, like he doesn't even use blue. He just uses like I think black and white and red and yellow, and he gets the blues from mixing black and white. They're basically grays, but because of the simultaneous contrast of the reds, it pushes that towards blue. And so yeah, you really don't. So yeah, I start with as little as possible and add as I need to each time. So,
do you always work in the studio, or do you work in the field as well?
I do both. I probably do most of my painting in the studio for years and years. That's what I'm mostly a studio artist, but I do like to get out. And there's things that when you're painting outside, like I work from photos a lot, but photos can't capture a lot of the color and the values out there. And so sometimes what I'll do is if I'm doing maybe a bigger painting that's going to take longer, I'll go out and do an on-location sketch so I can get the shadows the right color and the highlights and all that. And then I'll take photos, because photos are great for all the details, like how a branch comes down, what angle, and all that kind of stuff. And then I sort of put the two together, and then I can work up a painting. And then sometimes I just do, if it's a nature journal thing, I can just work right on the spot and just do everything right there. If I'm painting like stuff like plant leaves or things like that, I'll often bring those back in the studio because I can control the lighting with my studio lights and everything. But yeah, there's no substitute for painting out in the real world. And that's the cool thing about gouache too, that it's portable. And, painters have been using gouache, even oil painters, have been using gouache for hundreds of years because it's portable. And up until the 1800s, they couldn't even take their oil paints out, before there were tube paints. So they would take gouache out with them and do their on-location sketching and get everything and then bring that back to the studio and then do their oil paintings from it. So yeah, that's why gouache is like perfect for that kind of stuff, perfect for nature journaling and for recording things. And the cool thing about gouache is you can get pretty much every color you see. Very rarely do I find a color that I can't capture out there. Every once in a while there's some, but yeah, most of the time you can catch it. So
I've always been a watercolor artist, but I've been hearing so much about gouache lately that I'm planning to have a little experiment and a play.
Awesome. Yeah, I find that people come from watercolor have the hardest time with gouache.
Okay, because it's a different
it's different. Like, I came more from acrylic, and it's a little bit closer to acrylic technique. But with watercolor, you're basically starting with white paper, always white paper, because that's your white. You're not painting with white color unless you're putting gouache into your watercolor. So you're basically staining the color, and you're going from light to dark. So the color's the lightest color, and then you're gradually darkening it, staining it, and pretty much glazing it with whatever color you're doing and mixing it, which is really cool. And I love watercolor paintings, but I think it's the hardest type of painting at all because you can't correct it either. Once you put it down, that's it forever. And with gouache is real correctable. So it's hard because people are used to doing these sort of stains and these washes and gradients and building up. And gouache, you can work light to dark or dark to light, either way you want. You have all of that, a lot more freedom that way to paint. And so I find that, watercolor people try to apply that watercolor technique to it, and then they get frustrated really easy. So
it's a process of relearning.
Yeah, but you can do it. I can paint watercolor paintings. They're not as good as my gouache paintings, but because I'm more of a tweaker, I kind of come back and adjust things. And whereas watercolor, you got to have it. You got to know exactly what you're doing for watercolor.
You can do a little bit of correction by lifting out, but it's challenging.
Yeah.
So you also do a lot of work in Procreate, which is a digital drawing tool, and I'd love to talk about digital art. How did you begin doing digital art?
Well, I've been using Photoshop for illustrations for probably 20 years or so. And before, what I was doing, actually well, actually more than 20 years, probably 30. Anyway, about 20 years ago, I was doing a lot of stuff for Pima County. And what I would do was actually, say it was a plant, I would paint it by hand in acrylic, and then I would scan it, and then I would bring it into Photoshop, and then I'd sort of cut out around it, and then I could layer it with a bunch of other illustrations I did. Mm-hmm. So they're basically sort of like montages, and I'd use Photoshop for that a lot. And then over time, these Wacom tablets came out where you could actually paint on it and stuff, and which is kind of cool, but it still looked Photoshop-y, kind of, mm-hmm. which I never liked. And in the meantime, I got an iPad, and then Procreate came out, and they have a lot of really good natural media brushes and stuff. And it's to the point now where I show people my Procreate stuff, and they can't tell that I did it on a tablet.
If it's traditional.
Yeah, and these are people that do the stuff all the time, and they can't tell. So I'm like, all right, if I'm fooling them, then it's really getting close. So I've been doing that for a while, and I actually use that commercially. I've done a lot of commercial artwork in Procreate. So.
And you even do your nature journal pages right there on Procreate sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah. Yeah, a lot of times.
It's really cool.
Yeah, a lot of times I totally do it 100% in Procreate. Other times I'll take a picture of it, of what I'm doing, because sometimes these paintings I'm doing, they'll be for my nature journal, but I also will have other uses for them, like for postcards or other things, so I don't want to write on it. So I will actually do my writing in Procreate over it, with a pencil. But yeah, some of it's totally Procreate, start to finish, which is fun too.
And is the process similar? Like you're building up in layers, and does it feel different for you? I know that it's not physical paper, but does the process feel similar?
It's getting more and more similar. It's pretty close now to where I have no problem switching back and forth from a brush to my Apple Pencil. But I mean, they both have pros and cons. But the big difference in the two is the main thing I love about digital stuff, which isn't in the real world, is undo. You don't have an undo in the real world, and so that's the best thing about it. And sometimes you can have multiple undos. I can go back 40 steps if I need to and Procreate, like undo.
Yes.
And sometimes you need to do that. And the other thing that Procreate or Photoshop have is layers. And you can do a lot with layers that you just can't do in the real world either. Like if I'm doing, I don't know if you have, I've posted a few on YouTube where I've done a couple of nature journal pages. Actually, I think the ones I sent you.
For International Nature Journal blog,
So like say I do the leaf on there, and then maybe I'll draw on a background first on a separate layer, and then I will have another layer above that, and I'll put the leaf on, and then I'm like, that background doesn't look right. So I can go back and totally change the background.
Swap the background out.
Sometimes I totally change it. Sometimes I just adjust it, but it's like, you can't do that in the real world. And so there's pros and cons, but the thing that it's not quite there, some of the brushwork, like you do not have the dexterity or whatever that you can do with a brush, how you can push it hard or soft. I mean, you can do that with Apple Pencil and get similar, but it's nothing like the real brush. So
but you're managing it, obviously, if you're fooling artists into believing that it's traditional work.
Right.
And you do this one thing I saw on one of your Skillshare classes where you take a photograph and you put it in Procreate. It was the one, I'm thinking of the one where you did a painting of a frog, and you put the photo in Procreate, and then you just draw a grid right there over it with your stylus. So you're putting a grid over your photograph, and then you're putting the same grid on your paper, and you're using that to help you get the proportions correct with the drawing. But I love this way that you just beautifully use technology and integrate that in your studio process with a physical page. And I'm wondering about that, your thoughts of using both digital and traditional art in tandem. Like you seem to be really well switching back and forward between the two and utilizing digital to benefit you in whatever way it can, like this way of putting a grid on your page like that.
Yeah, so I found that my iPhone and my iPad are really my best tools out of everything, really. And, even when I'm doing drawings, or gouache paintings in my studio, I've probably gone out with my iPhone and took some. And the iPhones are amazing now. The quality of
Yes.
the image that they get. And back in the old days when I was doing illustration, I'd have to photograph my reference and then send it to the to get processed the film and have to wait 3 days or whatever it
Yes.
is, and then you find out half of them are lousy photos. But now I can tell instantly, so I can
Yes.
like go into my garden, take a picture of a flower or a hummingbird or something, and bring it back, and I flip it onto my iPad, and then I've got a nice big image that I can zoom in on, and then I can do a painting from that, and I'm like, it's perfect. Especially if you're doing animals. So animals do not sit still for me
Yes.
very well at all. The hummingbirds don't sit still at all. So if I can capture one, and with the fast motion photography on the phone, I can actually freeze frame hummingbird wings on there if I do it in slow motion, and then I can just grab a frame out of the picture and like paint from that. So yeah, I found that it's a perfect reference tool. It's I mean, if Da Vinci or any of those guys had an iPad, they'd flip out.
They
They
would
would be
have.
using it. Some people are like, well, that's cheating. It's like, no, artists
It's a
use,
tool.
yeah,
Yeah.
they use whatever is available to them at the time.
Yep.
So yeah, it's
I
a cool
agree.
tool.
Mm-mm.
Very useful.
So, as well as nature art, you also paint a lot of historical scenes for interpretive signs and for murals. And I'm interested in your connection with history and depicting historical events in your artwork. I know you studied art history, but I'm also interested in like your rendering historical events in your work.
Yeah, so a lot of what I've been doing lately is the Anza Trail, which is in 1775, year before American independence. These guys came through Tucson, and they went across the desert up to the mountains of California and founded this city called San Francisco. So that happened in 1775, and the county and the National Park Service and everything wanted to bring a lot of attention to that. So I started doing these signs. Actually, I think it was about the year 2000, and I didn't have any reference material at all. And I'd start going to these events where people were dressed up, and I'd take photos and try to get everything as accurate as possible. And then I'd run the photos by these historians, and I'm like, is this, the right kind of boots, or the right kind of harness for the horse, for that time period. And so there's a lot of that. So there's actually, on that kind of stuff, there's a lot of work that goes on before I even start painting on that. But over the years, I built up a pretty good reference library from that period. And so I'm still doing stuff. And actually, I just finished a sign for the National Park Service that's going to go up in Tucson here for the Anza sign. And I did the whole, so it's a 2-foot by 3-foot sign. And I did the entire thing in Procreate from start to finish. So
yep.
So it turned out really good.
Yeah. Wow. I also saw that you did a mural and that your 3 sons were helping you paint the mural. And I wondered if art was a family affair for you. Do you have artists in your family?
Yeah. So actually, yeah, all 3 of my sons do artwork. So the oldest one, I think, is still doing, he's just now starting to get into painting airbrush on gas tanks and stuff for motorcycles and that kind of stuff. My middle son does freelance artwork. And he works a lot in Procreate, and he does these cool sort of robotic cyborg creations of half human, half robot, which are really well done. And then yeah, my youngest son too also does stuff, and they also do 3D and video and music. So yeah.
That's wonderful to be able to share that creative passion.
Yeah, it's fun, and that's what I sort of raised them to. It's basically about creativity.
Yes.
And I just sort of raised them to be creative. And so they have been. That's what they do. So yeah, they've got a rock band, and yeah, their music stuff. They do video, music, yeah, painting. So yeah,
It's a wonderful thing to have in your life, a creative habit. I think it makes life better in so many ways.
it does. Yeah, very fulfilling. Yeah, and I mean, I have to do something creative, every day.
Yeah.
I would say I have to paint every day, and it's mostly painting, but I do a lot of other stuff too, but yeah, I got to do something creative at least every day, or start getting kind of antsy.
Yes. What natural discoveries have you been documenting in your nature journal lately? What have your latest pages been documenting?
Oh, actually through this pandemic, I have not done too much nature journaling. I've gotten all
Hmm.
these freelance jobs, so I've been like
Yeah.
super busy. So I haven't
Uh-huh.
done too much, but when I do get out there, I really get into especially the flowers and the birds. Is what
Mm.
I really like the
Mm.
best. Yeah, and sometimes I'll even, I'll take photos and then I'll bring them into the studio and sometimes dissect the flower and sort of, fold it open and look at the flower parts and get a little magnifying glass out and, do studies from that, which is it's fun. Yeah, interesting. And one of the things one of my discoveries was I've got a jojoba bush, which I don't know if you know. Jojoba is what they make jojoba oil out of. It's the
Yes.
plant that saved the whales because it's got the same similar oil as ambergris. Anyway, I noticed my plants, some of them didn't have flowers and other ones did, or they fruited and the other ones didn't. And I'm like, this is weird. And they did have flowers. I just didn't know what I was looking at, but they're so kind of alien
Okay.
looking, that I started
Ooh.
doing research and I'm like, oh, these weird looking little things here are flowers. So the male and female flowers are totally different from each other. And I didn't even know what I was looking at. And they've been growing in my yard for years until I started actually really looking at it and and asking questions. So John Laws was saying, in the book, like why, why is this, like put questions on your paper, and
Yeah.
it's like, and so a lot of times I'll do that, as I'll say, why is this, and I'll look it up, on the internet or look up stuff, and it's like, oh, that's why, or what's eating this bush, and I find out, okay, these are the predators, for this flower or plant. So it's interesting. So
Isn't that fun to look at something that you've been looking at for years, but with a nature journaling mindset, and you go into that rabbit hole and discover things you didn't know you didn't know.
exactly, and it's actually all around you all the time. And I mean, I figure, nature's like the body of God, and you're just going deeper and deeper into that, the real
Mm.
creator, that's the
Wow.
person that's created everything. So, yeah, you're going deeper and deeper into that creativity and just sort of the wonders unfold, as you go deeper into it. It's pretty amazing. It's fun.
That's a beautiful description. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. It's been amazing to go all the way into your process and unpack the way you make your beautiful art. So thank you so
Yeah, thank
much.
you. It's fun.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with Bill. I felt like it was an art lesson, which I really appreciated. I'm inspired now to try gouache and see what comes of it. I'm interested to know about your favourite tools and techniques. Drop me a line on social media and let me know what you're experimenting with lately. Do you use gouache? If you have any tips for me, let me know. If you'd like to learn more about Bill and his work, follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.